for turning up. And it's
I'm Chris.
Christopher, in case you hadn't seen pictures of us before. And I'm really excited to be here to talk about Chris's new book, which I just finished rereading, and it's insanely great. I just confirmed that he knows it's his best book, and one that I'm terrifically excited for you guys to get a chance to read. And it is a book that is possible to spoil with spoilers, so I'm going to have to do some dodgy, paraphrase or just get vague and abstract.
Silverblatt just took care of that today, so there are no spoilers left.
Yeah, he exposed all your secrets. But it's a book full of, just like the exciting blurbs suggest, intrigue and sex and danger. There is an open grave at the end into which certain characters tumble. But it also, of course, is characteristically extraordinary journey into voice, and several different voices. I think my favorite character that Chris has ever written is this woman, Kat Danhoff, who is a kind of I don't know what to call her. She's an investigative journalist, wannabe. She's working journalist, but she doesn't really get very many assignments that rise above the level of.
She's got the garden party beat.
Yeah, she gets to go and cover the state fair and things like that. But she's fine. It really does make it sound like a 1930s movie. She's finally got her teeth into a big case.
It's the front page.
Yeah, this is something that might hit the front page. And then there is a tormented mid-career famous loser novelist who named Sandy Mulligan, who is also an extraordinary voice and very, very funny, self-infatuated and self-loathing type. And if you know Sorrentino's work, you know that you can expect these extraordinary sentences and the extraordinary passages of extended mental fugue, philosophical, emotional passages of coruscating, ranting, brilliant language. But what's so different in some ways in this book is that you wrote a plot, you wrote a story. So one of the things I want to talk about with Chris is what it was like to it's kind of like Kat Danhoff gets her teeth into a case. You got your teeth into a story in a very different way.
And it bit back.
Yeah, right. So there's this passage on page 26. I asked Chris if he wouldn't mind if I read a little tiny bit of the book out loud. So I'm going to read this to set the table. Think of the story as a basic unit. Stand at the counter in the kitchen in the morning, shoveling in yogurt and bran. The old story of trying to live forever. Why do you eat bran? Well, I want to live. That's one story. Or you say, dropping the spoon into the bowl to finger your jawline, I cut myself shaving, and the missus says, I'll grant you, an extraordinary level of awareness. Wasn't that a new blade? And the story wends its way through all the satisfying twists and false conclusions, the way it used to be, how I learned to shave, the corporate misfeasance of Gillette, ending zen-like on the decision to grow a beard. This is how everyone lives. The traffic and lines, the rude clerks and precocious children, the price hikes and small happy surprises. Times without number, continuous. And one day we look down to see our hands doing whatever it is they happen to be doing, chopping vegetables, typing, jerking off.
This child.
And we finally recognize the truncation in that perpetual view, the necessity of a mind's eye in order to see all of ourselves at all. We realize that we have been stuck staring at those hands for as long as our lives, ourselves accruing and forming from the imperceptible blending of each moment into the indistinguishable modules of a whole, the unending stream narrated entirely by a hero without a face. Those hands the only unvarying things, from delivery room to deathbed, to mark the fact that what we witness is ours and not someone else's. How can we live if we don't make discrete chunks of that continuum? This basic unit, the proffered parcel of our days and nights alone, anecdote and memory, association and reminiscence, conjecture, desire, and regret. The bones of the lunchtime saga over a glass of wine. So, coming out of that, my question is more than just how did you find yourself writing a story after all these other kinds of ways of driving a book, but is it age? Is it getting older that made you stare narrative in the face this way for the first time? Is it about your life that is it about the I came to a journey, I came to a dark woods, yeah. Why story now?
Well, I either came to a dark woods or I came to senility, but I don't know if there's any particular life change that engendered the idea of confronting story. I think I was more interested in the ways that authors in particular, since an author is at the center of this novel, turn everything into a story and begin to narrate almost despite themselves, particularly when the truth, unvarnished and awkward as it may be, might be a better course. And that's what Sandy, who's the novelist at the center of the book, tends to do, is to avoid the truth when it's more felicitous for him to turn it into a kind of story. And I don't know if it was that I'd arrived at some point in my life where that was something I recognized in myself, or if that was just something I'd always recognized about myself as a novelist, because it seemed to have informed the decision to become one to begin with. Much easier to take control of your stories and set them down in a way that they can't actually be altered or rebutted than to deal with the truth and continually have to get closer to the things that are more uncomfortable to you and maybe to the other people to whom you're telling it. Take cover. Anyway, yes, that's the answer.
Yeah. So one of the the primary actions in this story, or that sets up this story, is flight. It's a story about absconding, departing, running away, getting out, and it becomes a city and country story. Sandy is in New York, in the heart of the action publishing industry, and the place where people feel they're at the center of everything, and runs away to the woods, but not quite. Runs away to kind of a margin where he can see the woods, the title sets the motif that there's a number of different levels at which these different characters are fugitives or on the lam from things, but you're still in the action. You're still in New York.
Me,
yeah,
the author.
You, the author.
Well, I've never had much success running away from anything. I mean, anytime I've tried to get away from New York, has always been a bit of a disaster. Maybe I just haven't found the right place to get to yet. And certainly the idea of leaving New York simply to write a book or to complete a project has never quite worked out either. These people and their various fugitive endeavors are, I think of them more as very typically American, and very typically American in this day and age, where not only is there carried forward that idea that's existed for the last 100 years or so of just, or more, of just picking up and leaving the place that you'd come from and the origins that you'd come from and finding a new identity that no one could really question, but also the various ways we have now of disguising ourselves, lying about ourselves, manipulating the way that we're perceived, both online and otherwise. And that seemed to me to be the thing that had begun to interest me in writing the book, because I hadn't really written a book about the present day before. You know, my other two books, one takes place in the early 80s, and I wrote it in the early 90s, and that seemed like ages ago at the time. And the other, which was published about 10 years ago, takes place in the mid-1970s and was, in effect, a historical novel. And I realized when I sat down to write this book that to treat the way we thought about ourselves nowadays and the means, electronic and otherwise, that we had to enable the realization of our vision of ourselves hadn't really existed even when I was writing those other books, and hadn't been treated by me yet. And that's part of the kind of story that these people are telling. Sandy's the primary storyteller. He's the one who earns his living doing it, but everyone in the book not only is telling a story about themselves or about what they want people to believe, but they're pushing it hard in a sense. They're kind of relying on it to protect themselves from consequences or ghosts that might otherwise come and catch them.
So, all right, there's a lot of stuff in there that I'd love to talk about. I should say, by the way, you guys can help me with some of the follow-up. I'm definitely going to turn this open and try to, help
sell books.
Help sell books, but help find other questions besides my own for Chris. So you can be thinking of them now. But so I want to follow up on the East and West stuff and talk about being from New York and coming to California and then going back to New York. But let's follow up on that 21st century modernity, the internet as a place where you go to be hidden and found, disclosed and disguised at the same time, and the problems that creates for identity construction and storytelling both. I mean, one of the things that I was really struck by was, the typical way in which Sandy is a novelist, and he's very typical of our caste or our clan, right, in being perturbed by the internet in certain ways. But the book doesn't formulate the problem for the novel that the internet poses as being one of the attention span. The typical, people's attention is too distributed or too thinned out or too partitioned. They'll never be able to sustain their focus long enough to read a book. There are jokes about the fact that nobody reads books, but the more striking critique is that there's something about the construction of the internet that turns everything into a kind of a product version of itself. Like instead of there being identity or language or a book, there's only this sort of sales vehicle, and the self and the book are equally subject to the same kind of erosion in that atmosphere.
Yeah, that's it exactly. I never really think of the internet as being something that, kills brain cells or makes it more difficult for people to focus on things. In fact, I think the focus that the internet encourages is one of almost total absorption, and it's sometimes not to the detriment of the person who's totally absorbed, but oftentimes it is. And as Jonathan has just suggested, the thing that began to interest me about it as I looked into it vis-a-vis the way that it's referred to in the book is exactly the fact that what a lot of people, I won't say everybody, but what a lot of people have discovered in the internet is a way of presenting themselves or their interests or the things that they're doing as a kind of sales and marketing device. And by extension, they themselves become a kind of branded product that can therefore be sold and marketed. And like most branded products, there has to be a kind of image that attaches to that product that can't have too much nuance and can't have too much of a downside. And so you often see people's self-presentation on the internet as being one of almost entirely self-congratulatory expressions. And this happens to have coincided, this technological development happens to have coincided, or perhaps is a natural outgrowth of this present-day idea that every single person is really a kind of creative entrepreneur. We're no longer employees. We're no longer citizens. We're no longer enthusiasts. We're no longer connoisseurs. What we are providers of a certain product, whether that product is internet content or artisanal pickles or whatever it is that we happen to be doing. And this encouragement has been taken up, it seems to me, by a lot of people. I'm not going to brand a particular generation with this particular attribute, but I would say that a lot of people, many of them younger, but some not so young, have taken up the challenge of becoming entrepreneurs, of capitalizing upon themselves and their interests and their abilities to do this, that, or the other thing, without in any way really thinking critically about what they're doing, and without in any way thinking critically about the ways in which their own true identities, such as they are, have been attenuated by this practice of devoting themselves to posting 96 tweets over the course of a day, or devoting themselves to a blog on vintage comic book covers of Venezuela from the 1970s, or whatever particularly esoteric thing they happen to be interested in.
Great. Well, so I'm going to read another little bit that's maybe extends the conversation about the contemporary atmosphere that fiction writing, novel writing, storytelling is trying to contend with here. So this is Sandy's agent telling him basically to finish his book. Or he hasn't really even begun his book, but to write a book, to send something in because it's the due date, and he's going to get himself in trouble with his publisher. And he says, Sandy's protesting. There's no book, which I think his agent at this moment in the story is hearing as it's not ready, it's not good enough, I haven't finished it, and he actually means there's no book.
He's not going to tip that.
The agent's reaction is, send them what you have and let Monty and his elves hammer it into shape like the shoemaker in that fairy tale. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the kind of okay. Writers fall for that crap all the time. Don't fall for it. He's falling for it. He's got this labyrinth he forces himself to spend years working his way through, with this total enigma at the center. So of course he's thinking of it as an enduringly profound artifact that he's creating. It's just a fucking story, Sandy. That's what you writers always forget. Look, 5 million years ago, some poor schmuck of a hominid was wending his way across the savannah when a lion jumps him and drags him off into the bushes. For millennia, he's just a skull and a pile of bones buried beneath the mud until an anthropologist digs him up, dusts him off, and ships him to the British Museum. The guy never did anything except scratch himself, throw rocks, and eat grubs. But now he entertains, informs, and enlightens millions. How are you going to top that? Maybe in a couple hundred years there'll be a few dozen doctoral dissertations on your work that no one's looked at in decades. Movies, Sandy, the closest you'll ever come to leaving your jawbone preserved in the mud somewhere in Africa, will be the movies made from your books. They won't even be remembering your work. They'll be remembering fucking Ethan Hawke.
I should point out that Ethan Hawke is sort of a running joke in the book. He starred in a movie made from one of Sandy's books. I think what I was getting at in that passage, especially as compared with the first passage that you read about the story simply being the way that we arrange the narrative of our lives for the sake of the people who share our lives or the people who intersect with our lives, I was, in that particular passage that Jonathan just read, kind of addressing the general, how to put it, the prevailing attitude that I find often in publishing nowadays, and by extension in the literary world generally, that would be the New York literary world, is that the perfect should not be the enemy of the kind of okay, that the kind of okay can always fly, that what we're really doing is we're putting out something with a shiny cover and some really good quotes from some recognizable names, and we're going to, through whatever obscure system of quid pro quo that exists, we're going to obtain coverage in the big newspapers and the magazines and on public radio and so on and so forth, and that the book, as the impetus for all of this frenzied activity, starts to become almost secondary. It's almost a kind of byproduct of this machinery of commerce that's rolling. And what Jonathan hasn't really gotten into, he's just alluded to it by giving my character, the agent's take on Sandy's creative dilemma, is the general attitude I take toward publishing in the book, which is sort of scabrous, although I have to say, for the sake of anybody who's involved in publishing that happens to be sitting in the room, obviously it's exaggerated for the purposes of satire, but not too much. There's nothing in there that I would say is there's nothing in there that I would say is untrue, and I would go slightly farther with that and kind of hearken back at this moment to what I had just said about the idea of the creative entrepreneur, because it's not merely the people involved in the publishing industry and the people involved in the book reviewing apparatus who are complicit in this. It's also a lot of readers who 20, 25 years ago would have been more or less passive enthusiasts for the books that they were reading. They would have read them, they would have talked about them amongst their friends, but now they are in a situation where they can become players in this scene. Their creative entrepreneurship involves this instantaneous publication of their ideas and their thoughts about books, often their insider knowledge about certain things that take place in the book industry. And what's strange about that, from my perspective, and probably from your perspective too, Jonathan, is I remember when the internet first began to talk about books more or less regularly, and maybe that was, 15 years ago? And my first thought at that time was, oh, that's terrific. There are all these books out there and all these authors out there who really deserve a second look. And the big publishing is publishing their usual 5 or 6 titles per season that everyone is expected to pay attention to, and that you see on the front page of the Times, or that you see in, Time magazine, or whatever happens to be the current bellwether of literary significance. And the internet is going to be correcting for that, because there will be all sorts of bloggers, one of whom a former one is sitting right in front of me, who will indeed talk about the books that are of interest to them, whether or not anybody else is interested in them. And that former blogger indeed did do that to the extent that he was able to in his blog. And we'll say no more about it, Mark, I'm sorry. But a reform blog, that's lapsed. I prefer lapsed. But instead, what ended up happening, I think, was there was this there was this process by which I think a lot of the bloggers who may otherwise have been writing about those interesting books that nobody else was paying any attention to in the so-called mainstream media realized that the conversation was leaving them behind. They realized that in order to be truly au courant, in order to really have their blog entries posted on Facebook or retweeted or whatever the means is of proliferating that kind of stuff, they were going to have to write about the exact same books as well. So instead of someone writing about, Paul Metcalf and his collected works, they would write about the new Franzen, or they would write about the new Eugenides. And there's nothing wrong about writing about those things, except, you can't do it without being cognizant of the fact that you are joining in a conversation that tends to be very limiting and exclusive. And instead of having this wide-ranging discussion of books and authors and any other cultural effusions that might happen to come down the pike, you had this very hugely concentrated conversation about 5 or 6 names, none of which really needed your contribution in order to gain the foothold in the world that they had been designed to get, but which you needed in order to gain the foothold. So in a sense, you're complicit in this exact same process of focusing and concentrating all the energy on Garth Hallberg's City on Fire, for example. Now, I don't know anything about that book. I know Garth a little bit, and he seems like a nice guy, but I also know that when you get paid $2 million for a book, and everybody and his brother who publishes a magazine or publishes a newspaper, who broadcasts on public radio or on the morning shows, is covering the book, you really don't need Joe Schlabotnik, the blogger who's working out of Topeka, Kansas, to kind of pipe up with his 2 cents too. But they'll take it. Knopf is not going to say, Joe Schlabotnik, don't blog about Garth Hallberg. Why don't you blog about, Maggie Nelson? And Joe blogs about it. So there is that kind of critical mass that tends to have focused around these titles, and tends to have focused around these titles because these people have embrace the idea of themselves as literary personalities, and the reason why they've embraced themselves that way is because they've adopted this kind of identity, and what's enabled them to adopt the identity is the technology, and working in concert with this sort of tendency of the publishing industry to focus all of its attention on very few of its products. And I think I managed to back out of that answer enough to get to the original premise Jonathan had posited.
So I want you guys to start thinking of things. I know that there's probably some terrific questions for Chris lurking out there. And what I'm going to do right now is shift gears a little bit from the insides of this book, which you guys all, I hope, are destined to encounter and be fascinated by, and talk about your trajectory, how you ended up with this as your 4th novel in this year. And it's also the time to say, Chris and I have an unusual amount of personal history. We were at high school together.
We were at high school.
And back before he knew or I knew necessarily that one another would get into this racket. Before necessarily I was even sure I would get into this racket. But
I think you were more sure than I was.
I had some ideas, but I was hiding them behind my official identity as a painting student, because an art student, because we were at Music and Art High School, along with our friend Neil, who's here witnessing this. And the first I knew of Chris, I remember a self-portrait you'd painted hanging on the wall outside Mrs. Sunshine's room.
Mrs. Sunshine.
That was her real.
She so wasn't. It was a misnomer. It really.
That was her real name. We actually had a really great array of. There was like a Mr. Fox and a Mrs. Katz.
Yes.
Mrs. Sunshine, and I feel like there was one other. Except, like out of a kind of children's storybook teacher name, but there's Right, wolf.
Right,
of course.
science.
There's wolf, fox, and cats. So we went to school. This is 1970s. We both were taking the subway up to Harlem to music and art. Except then Chris spun out, and you were a year ahead of me. And he went. You tell me. You correct me if I get this wrong. You went to something called City as School, which was this marvelous kind of sleight of hand where you got to just define New York City as your schoolhouse. And
you got a high school diploma for doing unpaid labor. Is basically what it was. Yeah. It was a precursor of the intern culture.
Industry.
And
right.
so the idea was to try and get as many internships as you could that required you to take the subway, because what they would do is give you a bunch of subway tokens. And then after you had the subway tokens in hand, you dropped the resources, that's what they called the jobs you were to go to, and kept all the ones that you could walk to. And then you cashed in your subway tokens, and you had money to buy beer with. It was great. So I mastered that. I got a diploma in drinking beer, basically.
Yeah. So, drinking beer was pretty much the next place I spotted you, at various punk clubs where you were either in the band or in the audience, or had just been kicked out of the band, or were just about to insert yourself into the band.
Or to get kicked out of the club.
Yeah, or get kicked out of the club. And but our connection was sporadic until we relocated each other in San Francisco, because we both, you talked about your unsuccessful attempts to run away from New York City, but we both did pretty good time in our 20s in the Bay Area. And in fact, that's where we both were self-inventing as writers, and published our first fiction while living there. Is that right?
We did.
Dolphy Archive did Sound on Sound, Chris's first novel.
My book came out, I think, about 6 months after Gun with Occasional Music, and it was at a reading for Gun that you and I reconnected.
That was reconnected. Chris spotted my name I was reading at some tiny little club in the Mission.
Yeah. It was called the Valencia Poetry Club or something.
That might be right.
And you and Alexander Lawrence set that up.
So now, apart from all the obvious forms of kinship, or the kinds I haven't revealed to you, like our long-suffering Mets fandom and so forth, the thing that I really want to get at that's worth talking about, I think, is the East-West tension. Because you were in San Francisco writing Sound on Sound, which was about the high school punk club scene of New York in the late 80s, right?
Early 80s.
Early 80s,
but
really.
Things were already over
mid-80s,
by then, yeah.
And I took a while actually to figure out to write about New York City. I was living in Berkeley and Oakland and working in bookstores, and Gun with Occasional Music. And the next couple of books were, I didn't disclose my New York childhood or connection at all. I just wrote about things in the West for a while. But you did the double reverse. You moved back to New York. We both moved back to Brooklyn at a similar point.
I think you were about 6-8 months behind.
Right. At which point I began writing about New York City, and you spent 15 years writing a novel about San Francisco.
It wasn't quite 15 years, but yes, I did
Which is
write
Trance.
about the West Coast. Trance, the patio.
Your SLA novel. So now, so here we have you. There's the consuming LA loathing and curiosity about the life of New York City, the arrogance, the solipsism. But so you're visiting here. Do you? What did your California time do to your sensibility? What did it do to the writer who would end up writing Fugitives, about a New York writer dreaming of escape?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because I was actually thinking about it this morning. I haven't been in California in a few years, and so it always stirs up a lot of really acute memories for me, because I did live here for a long time, and it left quite an impression on me. And I sometimes feel that in having grown up in New York, moved to California, and then moved back to New York, that what I managed to do is completely efface whatever impression California left on me. But all I have to do is well, not exactly get off the plane at LAX or SFO, but get into the towns to realize, like, oh no, nothing's gone. I remember all of this. I remember the smell of the wind, the temperature of the wind, the way people drive, whatever. But to answer your question, what's interesting about my experience in California is that in a sense, a very remote sense, I wouldn't say that there's a direct causal relationship between the two. Moving out to California was the very first time that I realized that it was possible to say, I don't have to be that person that I was. I moved out here when I think I was 20, and to have left behind all of my middling failures as a teenager, all of my embarrassments, all of those parts of my life that I didn't necessarily want to have trailing along behind me the way they were with the old friends with whom I associated in New York and with whom I still associate in New York from time to time, was a revelation. Nobody could know. Certainly back then in 1983 or whatever it was, there was no internet to speak of to leave a trail. There was no way for anybody to double check. There was no way for anybody to know anything about me except what it was that I chose to tell them. And I took full advantage of that, really. I didn't spin incredibly wild tales about myself. I just omitted things. These were lies of omission and selection that I took full advantage of for a long, long time until, of course, I'd built up enough of a history in San Francisco and the Bay Area to say, well, it's time to go back to New York and start lying again. But really, it was kind of an eye-opener, and it wasn't even that conscious. It wasn't like I set out to be Jay Gatsby and just reinvent myself entirely for a specific purpose. It just seemed to be a kind of slope that gravity allowed me to roll down very, very easily. And so when writing this book, that's probably the primary emphasis that the book places. The reason why it's called The Fugitives and not The Fugitive is because everybody in this book has made the exact same discovery about what they can do with their lives and what it is that they can efface and eliminate and avoid. And the storytelling aspect of it, because the book might as well be called Storytellers, and I briefly considered it, but I think there is a novel called Storytellers, so I decided not to. They're all making this new reality for themselves out of these stories that they tell and the ways that they shape them. One thing about writers that writers understand, I think, more consciously than other people is that what makes a story, that story about eating bran or talking about cutting yourself shaving, is the fact that you often leave out the parts that are boring or inconvenient. And everybody who tells a story knows that instinctively. Writers just grab hold of that instinct and make it part of their practice. So that's really the influence that the West Coast had on me and my novel writing, especially vis-a-vis this novel, but possibly all of them. I mean, the novel about Patricia Hearst is, to a certain extent, about people who decided to change who they were. It's about a lot of people who were mostly middle-class, nice kids who were on the pep squad, who ended up arming themselves with automatic weapons and running around California fantasizing about overthrowing the U.S. government. And their most famous convert, of course, was the fabulously wealthy agent of the upper class, the 1%, as we'd say today, Patricia Campbell Hearst. And even my first novel, Sound on Sound, is about people who, they grow up in the West Village or Soho or the Upper West Side, and their idea of themselves is to change their names to, Jackie Shithead or whatever happened to be, Okuran in the day and dress in outlandish costumes and go and play music. And then we flash forward in that book to a point at which they've managed to get rid of that part of their lives and become something else. So you might say that these questions of identity and its fluidity have always been really, really interesting to me in all of my work. And this is maybe the book where I'm going to have to turn to something else to be interested in, because I think I said everything I needed to say about it.
Well, and it is like a traditional function of the Easterners' mythos of the westward journey is self-invention, self-perfection, or self-erasure, right? You come here to clean the slate.
Right, but then, of course, when you get here, as Nathaniel West pointed out, you get mad because not only you thought you'd fool them all by coming out here and being someone else, but it turned out that the place you came to fooled you. And I'm not speaking specifically of Los Angeles. I know a lot of people are still mad at Nathaniel West for his take on Los Angeles, but I look at that as more allegorical than as literal-minded. I think that West is cautioning us about those kinds of easy solutions generally.
Great. So let me try to pull other voices in here. I'm hoping you've got questions. Neil? Hey.
Hey guys, thanks so much. It's wonderful to hear you both talking. Chris, I love the book. I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was your best book.
Thank you, Neil. Me too.
Yeah, and I like that you wrote a potboiler. It's got murder, it's got intrigue, it's got action, it's got supernatural revelation. I won't give away too much. But
no, emphasize the pot. It really is a great read. There's a lot of copies up there, and you can all find out for yourselves.
But it's also, it's something growing up with you. I remember being very, very. Chris turned me on to literary fiction when I was a kid. His dad was the senior editor at Grove Press for how many years, and so through his influence, I was turned on to tons and tons and tons of writers that changed my life. And back then, there was kind of a prejudice against storytelling that I sort of absorbed from you. And so it's just nice to see that, you kind of come full circle. But at the same time, it still maintains the formal concerns and linguistic flair. I mean, it's got everything. So I just really loved it. But I wanted to ask you, when you were reading that little section, the second section, there was something about the editor talking about an enigma at the heart of the book. And this is something I remember discussing with you about Trance, your previous novel, which is that as I recall, you told me the Patty Hearst character I think there was a process of whittling her out of the book. And so what you have there, that I think a lot of critics completely missed, and I think the first New York Times review of this new book also completely missed, is this idea of a cipher at the heart of the book. In this book, you have this fake American Indian who, by the end of the book, it's dubious whether he even exists. Is the supernatural revelation just a trope to reveal his absurdity or what? I don't know. But I'm just wondering if you'd care to talk a little bit about this process, because I can't think of any other writers that really put a cipher. I mean, it's kind of an anti-commercial thing to do. People are reading your book, Trance, hoping to meet Patty Hearst, and she's just not there. And it's the same with this book. There's this character that everyone's interested in, but he's barely there. I'm just curious how that evolved.
Well, I don't know if I'm the only one doing it. I mean, if you go to like Hammett, for example, and you've got the Maltese Falcon, I mean, in a lot of cases, the thing that the action is organized around is what Hitchcock would have referred to as a MacGuffin, which takes on this disproportionate kind of importance in the narrative, but doesn't actually materialize or have any real bearing on why we're all gathered there. Or rather, it's why we're all gathered there, but doesn't have any bearing on what happens after we've gathered there.
Hammett even allegorizes this with the Flitcraft episode at the center of the cipher at the center of the cipher. Exactly.
I forgot about the Flitcraft episode. But to answer your question less pedantically, I always think In the case of Trance, I had never had any intention of shedding light on Patricia Hearst. That seemed to me to be the least interesting thing I could possibly do with the book would be to identify or to psychoanalyze or otherwise to bring her into focus in a way that we'd finally say at the end of 500 pages, that's why. The whole point of Patricia Hearst as being at the center of that book was for her to be someone everybody reading the book and everybody who was involved in the book could kind of project their own ideas upon. And it's sort of the same way with the character of Salteau and his storytelling there. Sandy, the novelist, spends a lot of time talking about Salteau. What is it about Salteau that he's drawn to? Because I don't know if Jonathan had mentioned this, but once Sandy gets to the town in Michigan where he decides to woodshed, what he ends up doing rather than writing is hanging out in a library watching Salteau tell stories to kids.
This is Native American storyteller who has an hour at the library. Very kind of podunk American, scene that you wouldn't normally fixate upon.
Especially if you were, Mr. Literary Star, as Sandy seems to be. And Sandy spends a lot of time thinking a lot about why he's drawn to this guy. And what he does in thinking about it is he will propose various reasons why this guy is so particularly inviting or attractive to him, and then kind of respond to them and say, well, no, it's not that. And one thing that you notice if you read the book is that over the course of the novel, he's never really quite able to identify what it is about Salteau that draws him in. But then you have Kat, the other narrator, the reporter, and she has an entirely different idea about why she's interested in Salteau, and that idea is that she believes he's an imposter who's involved in a theft, and so her idea is very concrete. She's able to answer it in a very concrete way, and yet again, it turns out that her assumption is entirely wrong, and so this seems to me generally as a kind of technique or as a kind of approach to a novel of being a way to organize the activity of a lot of people, a lot of characters who might otherwise have no reason to come into contact with each other around an idea that they are all obsessed with for reasons that are entirely self-serving. It's not the same thing as writing a novel about, I don't know, the Crusades, where everyone's like, yeah, let's go spread Christianity throughout North Africa or whatever it might be. This is an idea about, here's an object or a person or an idea that holds a lot of desire for me individually, and I don't really care how it affects the other people because I'm going to take advantage of that idea.
It really is a Maltese Falcon organization.
It is, and this is the first time I'd actually thought of it in terms of Hammett and the Maltese Falcon, and yet Hammett and the Maltese Falcon is the perfect analogy for what I'm doing.
Well, but it's also the golden bowl. It's the container, the empty vessel into which desire pours, right, from every direction.
And it's all about desire. I mean, that's another thing that I think a lot of people haven't quite gotten about this book is that it's the reason why these people are changing themselves, the reason why these people are running from whatever they're running from, the reason why these people are running toward whatever they're running toward is because of desire. They're all remarkably unfulfilled, and in that sense, the book is, to me, in addition to being funny or perspicacious or whatever it happens to be, it also is a really sad book because these people are desperate. They're really desperate characters, and they all want something that they think is just within their reach, but not only is it not within their reach, but in pursuing it, they're about to screw up whatever equilibrium it is that they've managed to attain. And by the end of the book, I can say, without giving too much away, they pretty much do upset their equilibrium.
So, more questions for Chris? A couple more anyway, before we make him sign books.
You guys are bringing sort of an interesting place to both comment about inheritance or genetics, knowing what you guys, like son or, patrimony in that sort of sense, and also sort of like racial or ethnic minority mourn in a certain way. And I know you wrote a book about sports. I'm like thinking about the stuff with Steph Curry these days, and like
say that again.
Steph Curry.
Oh, he's the son of, right?
Like the son of, and like
Yeah.
the one thing you can't flee, no matter how much you are, is like Phil Roth in a sense. Like if you don't believe in God, all you are is the son of the people before you, and all they are is the sons of the two people who came before them. So I know you're writing about neurobiology, and you obviously have references to Mulligan in this new book. So if you guys could speak some way about inheritance.
Yeah, I mean it's striking. I mean Neil made mention of Chris's dad, who was a great American writer and also a guy who didn't get his due. And my father, who's still alive, is an unfamous American painter. There's just no other way to put it. And they didn't know one another. But what unifies our relation, I think, in a really particular way, is that they come from an era of American, artistic practice, and in a way, cultural practice. The way a painter or a writer and an editor for Grove lived and occupied space, cultural space in New York City, and the city that was theirs in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s when we come of age, and it's begun to curdle and disappear. And both Chris and I grew up in a city that was a magnificent, disappointed place,
And possible.
Yeah.
And there was possibility there. I think the thing that binds Jonathan's dad, Richard, and my dad, Gilbert, is the fact that Jonathan's dad was an unfamous painter and is an unfamous painter, and the fact that my father was an unfamous writer wasn't of paramount importance in a way that I don't think either Jonathan or I can say we share. For my father, and I can't speak for Richard, my father began as a poet back in the 1950s, and his expectations as a poet were very low. What he wanted was to publish poems that weren't like the poems that were appearing in the New Yorker, that weren't like were appearing in the bigger journals like Poetry. And his way of going about that would be what we nowadays call DIY. And so he published in magazines that were put together by like-minded poets, and he had his own magazine in which he published like-minded poets. And when he switched and became interested in writing prose, it was his same attitude that took hold. And his first few books were published by trade publishers who took a chance on him and didn't sell. And then he managed to have something of a splash that kind of gave his career a sort of false buoyance. But I think through all of that, whether he was up or down, my father was writing what he wanted to write. And I'm pretty sure that's what Richard's painting, too. And the provenance that both Jonathan and I think, managed to obtain from our fathers is that, well, I'm happy to cop to the fact that being a significant writer in terms of whatever that happens to mean nowadays is more important to me than it was to my father, and I think Jonathan would say the same thing. I think if tomorrow we woke up and our names had been stricken from that golden notebook in which all the important writers are listed, and we were just left to start where we were back in like 1989, we'd start where we were back in 1989. And I think that marks a difference between us and Again,
the book poses this. At one point in Sandy's spiral, he poses to himself the question, would the last man on Earth write a novel?
And I answered this question. Actually, I was asked about this. I was just interviewed by Dana Spiotta, whose new wonderful book is about to come out this week, and I urge you all to buy it. But she'd asked me about that, and I told her that I thought the answer was yes if he were a novelist, or she. I think that if you're inclined to write novels, you're inclined to write novels, and it doesn't matter if you're writing them for gigantic crowds of applauding people and selling the rights to Scott Rudin for millions of dollars, or whether you're simply writing for yourself or for a audience the size of this room. Again, I can't really speak for Jonathan, but I suspect that he and I have the same attitude. What we do creatively is intermingled with who we are in a lot of ways. And if someone were to say, here are ways of compromising your art that will guarantee you a certain stature, a certain prestige, a certain level of wealth, will you do it? I would, of course, think about it because I think it's my responsibility. I have 4 kids, and one of them goes to an expensive college. But I also would probably, in the end, say, no, I don't think I can quite do that. I mean, if there's another way.
Well, don't you think that also the unwillingness shades into the incapacity, so that you'd probably brag of refusing to protect the fact that you wouldn't really actually be capable of functioning?
Maybe you've had this same situation, but I've often said in moments, there are 2 things I say in moments of extreme frustration with my career, which is, fuck this, I'm going to law school. And I said it just a couple weeks ago, actually, but that's a really empty threat. Although I've looked into it. There's a great CUNY law school for social justice law, so I wouldn't have to worry about
city as law school.
It's
that's
not,
what you need to find. Yeah.
No, it's for real. Look it up. It's good. That's where I went before. But and the other thing I say is, God damn it, I am going to write a real potboiler, not some sort of like literary novel like wrapped up in the trappings of a potboiler. And I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write it. I'm going to write just like one of those goddamn New Yorker stories where like Biff and Marie discover that in the closet that photo album is going to tell them some truth about their lives together that they never would have suspected. And in the end, when Biff goes out to get the tartine, Marie says, it would never be the same, or whatever. I mean, all right, that's a very cruel take on a New Yorker story, but not that far off the mark. But when I say that, Minna, who I live with, always says to me, you're going to fuck it up because you can't do something like that without subverting it.
Weren't we trying to sell out when we wrote that book about the Mets?
I thought we put Bill Thomas in the broom closet and told him we'd let him out when he gave us the contract.
Yeah. So, okay, one last question for Chris, and then we'll make him sign some books. If there's somebody who wants to be the finale. Hey there.
When you pitched this book to an agent, he or she became aware that it had this meta publishing thing with a writer and an agent. Did they try and dissuade you and say, well, books about books or books about writers are difficult? Did that ever come up?
Good question.
I don't know about tackling publishing that way, sort of an inside baseball thing.
That's a really good question. To tell you the truth, I had several talks along the way, not so much about the publishing stuff, but about the writer stuff. My former agent, to whom I'd shown some of these pages when the book was very early on, I showed him maybe the first 150 pages. His first objection, and I don't feel bad characterizing this way, was like, oh, it's about a writer. Nobody wants to read books about writers. And I said, fuck you, or whatever I said to him. He is my former agent, but that's not why I didn't fire him. He just left the business. But But then my present agent read it, and he expressed some concern, writing about writers, can't you make them a photographer or something? I said, well, it's really kind of, it is about storytelling. It's not about picture taking. And then when the book was acquired by Simon & Schuster, my editor, without putting any pressure on me, I have to say to his credit, did say, you're going to take shit about it being a book about a writer. And this was all, I guess, before, Knausgaard broke big and Ben Lerner wrote 1001. And so that particular canard, 1004, thank you. That particular canard, I think, has been dispelled. The publishing stuff is much more interesting. There's a lot of satire in the book about contemporary publishing, as I think I alluded to slightly earlier, and my only sense of why nobody's really objected to it too much is because, A, it's really broad and exaggerated for the purposes of satire. So I think a lot of people can see in the business that I'm not really alluding to anything specific or particular. They feel the way people often do when they're sort of the oblique target of satire, like, he's not talking about me, he's talking about that guy. And
they're all like Donald Trump. They look at their hands like, he's not talking about my hand. I got perfectly good hands.
And the other thing, too, is I think, and this is very general, that people really appreciate work that satirizes the absurdities that tend to cohere around their vocations. Los Angeles is famous for it with like these kind of self-referential Hollywood movies in which like the weird horse trading and ins and outs that surround filmmaking become these critical hits. People love that stuff. But I did mean it. I want to make certain that everybody knows that. While I was exaggerating and while I was doing my best to, disguise specific personalities to the extent that any specific personalities were being lampooned, everything I say about publishing and its really overwhelming preoccupation with publishing schlock that looks as if it's going to do well for the bottom line, but doing their best to present it as if it's very high art, is absolutely the way that commercial publishing is going. And I think it's reprehensible in a lot of ways. They devote so much energy trying to convince us to buy books that they spent too much for, and so little energy trying to promote the careers or develop the careers of authors who, after 4 or 5 or 6 books, will have this significant backlist and significant body of work that they can use. But I think that line of thought and the way that I was implicitly criticizing it in the book was not something that really occurred to the people who read it or who promoted it. And I have to say, too, also, just to cover all my bases, when I say publishing, I'm not referring to individuals in publishing, because I've been really fortunate to work with a lot of editors and publicists and others who actually really care about the books that care about books generally. They read them, they think about them, they want good books to do well, they like the books they're publishing and they want them to do it. It's not just a simple question of like, hey, Duck Dynasty Cookbook, How to Lose 50 Pounds in 20 Days, and The Fugitives, they're all kind of the same widgets. Like, that's not really what I've encountered. I just think that those people are the ones who are fighting losing battles, and I've seen a lot of those people end up switching careers entirely, or moving from a big house to a much smaller house, or otherwise finding their ability to fight the good fight from within being really impaired by that bottom line mentality that publishing has embraced, to the exclusion of anything more felicitous toward the art itself.
I think we should stop and let people meet you one-on-one and scribble in their books. So thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Where do you want this?
You've been listening to the Skylight Books Author Reading Series. Don't forget that you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.